Yeah.
Hey friends, so this is the exclusive content for the April newsletter on my website. It is so cool to have you all thinking with me. Thank you again for subscribing and joining this journey to think well about living well, to put in practice these philosophical ideas that we discuss together. So I've decided that I'm going to change up a little bit about how these videos work. In the past, I had mentioned that they were exclusive to my newsletter subscribers precisely because I was trying to create this radical difference and opportunity for those of you who get subscribed to the newsletter to have access to new content. But I realized that once you all had access to this content, that it was actually stuff that other people might enjoy and might want to engage. So now what's going to happen is every month, if you're subscribed to the newsletter, on the first of the month, you'll get the new newsletter, which includes these new videos, and they will be exclusive to you for the entire month. And then when the next video comes out as part of the next newsletter, the previous video will then be made public on my YouTube channel. This way, these long-form videos, the more informal way of thinking together that we do here, is something that also hopefully encourages others to find it compelling and want to join in with us. And hopefully they'll then get subscribed to the newsletter and begin receiving these videos as they're being deployed. Now, what's cool about this, of course, is it allows you and me to engage and think together in an exclusive fashion for a full month. So when you watch this, if you've got comments, thoughts, questions, please drop them here on YouTube so that I'm able to engage with you directly before it gets opened up to the public the next month. So anyway, little explanation about how we're going to do this. Thank you again so much for joining me as we think together and talk along the way. All right, so it's April. It's the beginning of spring, the change of seasons. And so this has gotten me thinking a lot lately about a very old and classical philosophical idea or question. What is it that we are to make of reality? Is it something that is in constant change, constant flux, or is it something that is constantly stable? It's unchanging at its core. This is a debate between these great thinkers, pre-Socratic thinkers, Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides suggests that everything is ultimately one and at rest. If it's all the same thing, the same substance, it's not able to change because if it changed, it would become something that it's not. It becomes something else. Alternatively, Heraclitus suggests that everything is always changing because the only way that it's able to be what it is for it to be in constant movement, constant transformation. This is maybe a way of distinguishing between being, Parmenides, and becoming, Heraclitus. Now, it's important to understand both of these ideas can be taken too far. It's entirely possible to understand Parmenides as saying that everything we think changes is really just an illusion, and it's easy to think that for Heraclitus, nothing is ever stable enough to even be identified with itself. These excessive readings are ones I think we should avoid, not necessarily as good or bad readings of these thinkers, but as problematic for our benefiting from their ideas. In other words, what I'm going to suggest is that Parmenides and Heraclitus are both on to something really important. And it's only something that we can appreciate and appropriate and put in practice if we recognize that they're both right to some degree. So how might that work? Well, think about it this way. For Parmenides, the idea that everything is stable and the same is effectively a suggestion that when we go about living, we go through reality, there is a fundamental structure to it. It's what makes it intelligible. Think about it. There is no experience we can have that is meaningful unless it is in some way anchored in that which we've already understood. So radical difference, radically other experiences are unlikely even to be narrated as significant or meaningful. We couldn't even recognize or make sense of them. It would be sort of like, a three-dimensional being trying to make sense of four dimensions, or a four-dimensional being trying to explain itself to a two-dimensional being. There's a fundamental disconnect. And so it's only in light of stability, in light of things being what they are, that we can continue to make sense of them as experienceable, as stable enough to then identify when they change, right? And that opens on to Heraclitus. For Heraclitus, the idea of radical change can go too far when he says that you can't even step in the same river twice. Now, what he means by that, of course, is pretty philosophically sophisticated. He's suggesting that it can only be the same river if it is stable enough for that identity. That's the Parmenidean point, right? Only if there's some stability, some stasis, some being, could we talk about the same river. But yet, as we've all experienced, when you step into a river, the water is always changing. It's always flowing. It's always transforming. And given enough time, the rocks will be worn down and the riverbed will shift and the flow will adjust depending on recent rain or different sorts of melt from snow. So what it is that Heraclitus reminds us of is when we get locked into what we might call the inertia of the everyday, that everything just is the way it is and we can't break free of this, we can't get out of this. That's when we begin to lose the ability to see the possible. And when we don't see things as possible, as different, as open-ended, as changeable, we get stuck and stagnant. So that water that was flowing and vibrant is now, the pond that has grown stale and begun to rot. Instead of propulsing life, it's actually eliminating it. So this idea, this tension between change, stability, between being and becoming, between Parmenides and Heraclitus, this is actually something that I think is not best understood for us as complicated metaphysical debates, but instead as a way of inviting us to recognize the constancy of needing to live in a world that is stable enough to allow us to prepare for different experiences. In other words, it's only because we can expect something that we can also be wise enough to realize that we may not be able to predict what that something involves. Now, how might we put this into practice? What does this mean if we sort of give it some traction, some legs? I want to actually suggest that it's kind of like thinking about going mountain biking. Now, this is probably not a surprising example if you are familiar with my work on YouTube. I'm an avid mountain biker. I've become kind of addicted to it over the last 2.5 years. And part of what I love about mountain biking is the fact that every time I get on the bike, there is a bunch of stuff that must remain the same. Right? My foot position on the pedals has to remain the same in order for me to get the right kinds of traction, in order to use my muscles in the right sorts of ways. If I allow my feet to slide in ways that are problematic, my feet can come off the pedals can flip up, they can strike my knee or my shins. It can cause me to even go over the bars, to have bad accidents. Riding position. I've got to have this neutral position, what they call the ready position, that allows me then to be able to adapt and change as the terrain comes and gives itself to me in ever unfolding ways. But unless I've got that constancy of foot position and ready position that allow me then to adjust my feet on purpose because of a particular obstacle, or drop, hinge, anti-hinge, do the things that are required, row or anti-row, all of the movements of my body are then responses to the transforming terrain that I'm moving through. Maybe a way to give this a little bit of visual aid let's talk about helmets, right? In order to think through mountain biking, it's important to realize that you've got to have the right gear. You've got to be prepared for what it is that you might encounter. And so one of the necessarily true things is that you're going to encounter stuff that is dangerous if you don't ride it well. It can overwhelm you. It can overrun you if you aren't adapting in the right ways. But if all you do is adapt rather than understanding your adaptation is anchored in some stasis that you've practiced and you've put into motion and has become habitual, then you're not actually able to ride the mountain. You're just trying to resist it. So, for example, I have several different kinds of helmets. This is a helmet I wear when I'm on less technical trails, trails that I know better, that I have ridden many times. And the reason for this is it is very protective, very helpful, but it also allows for really good visibility. It allows for me to have very good ventilation. It's not a hot helmet. So if I am riding in the middle of the summer, this helmet is awesome because it doesn't make my head too hot and it allows me to navigate the trails with safety, but without discomfort. The problem is, what if I'm on trails that are more gnarly, that are more difficult, that are more problematic? Well, it turns out that I have another helmet that is exceptionally beefy. It's also really, really hot. So this helmet, although it does a great job of protecting me in downhill terrain, it also, though, comes at a cost, right? So I've got to then think through, what is it that is likely to be the same? Well, if I'm riding in July, it's likely to be hot in South Carolina and North Carolina. But also if I'm riding a trail that is a black diamond, right, it's probably going to be a pretty tough trail. So I'm depending on that being the case, the same, understandable, translatable, in order for me then to say, because I know that, I can wear this helmet because it allows me to navigate stuff that is going to be more difficult to work through. It's precisely because I know that I can't expect all of the obstacles that I need more protection. And yet it's also because I am very able to recognize, but wait a minute, in July it's going to be really hot. This helmet, though it gives me that protection, maybe it's not one that I'm going to be wanting to wear. It's not the right gear, even though it does some things very well. So I have a third helmet. This helmet is somewhere between the other two. So it's well ventilated, it's super lightweight, but it's also got better protection. And so this allows me then to find that middle ground if in fact I've got reasons to expect the trail is going to be pretty gnarly, pretty difficult, but also I can expect it's going to be pretty hot. Now, notice how this works out. These three different helmets for three different scenarios, my ability to decide which one to wear depends on my experience of the predictable. It's because Parmenides is right that I can predict with a fair degree of accuracy which is the right helmet for the right circumstances and the right terrain. And yet, why am I wearing helmets at all? Because Heraclitus is right. That what's going to be thrown at me is not fully predictable. It's not necessarily going to work out the way it did before. Even a trail I have ridden many times, maybe the rock has shifted. Maybe I navigate a particular obstacle and my foot does slip. Maybe I'm not in the right position. And that can get dangerous very quick. And so I wear helmets precisely because things change. Because stuff is not predictable. Because just because last time I rode it safely doesn't mean that I will this time. Being and becoming. Change and stability. It's only because both are part of our experience that our experience is as rich and as fruitful as it turns out to be. I actually think that this is summarized really well by one of my favorite poets, a poet who shares my son's name, though he is not my son. This is by the poet Atticus. And he simply says this: I had the aching feeling I always got when I stayed in a place too long. My bones became restless beneath my skin, like I'd forgotten how to run. I longed only for the great new, and so I packed my bags and stepped out onward toward the dusty roads of tomorrow and the never been. What is it Atticus is doing here? I think he's deploying the Parmenidean Heraclitean understanding of the tension that defines human existence. He's explaining why we wear helmets, but we also pick different helmets because we expect what we might encounter. When he says, I had the aching feeling that I had stayed too long, he's noting the fact that how we navigate and narrate and make sense of our life and our existence is always going to be something that has to be anchored in our understanding of what we've already done. It has to be something that allows us to go back to the same river, right? If we fished the same spot 50 times and never caught a fish, it's possible that we might catch one the 51st time, but it's also probably a good idea to go to a different spot on the river. That understanding of past experience informing the way that I want to open future possibilities is a powerful awareness, a powerful realization. But again, if we go too far in that direction, we then become stuck, right? As he says, aching feeling that I've stayed too long, right? He says his bones become restless. Emmanuel Levinas says somewhere that he knows with his bones, he knows in his bones, this or that. I love that idea because it recognizes, it admits the fact that knowledge is not just a cognitive thing, but it's a embodied thing. It's a practiced thing. The best mountain bikers, and believe me, I am not one of them. The best mountain bikers, though, are the ones who are able to adapt to changing circumstances so fast that they're not even having to process the adaptation. This is what the philosopher Aaron James calls adaptive attunement. And he says that the only way we can find the flow state, where we are flowing with what's given and yet moving with the change that what is given presents and provides, we have to adapt because we are attuned. But we can only be attuned if we, recognize the harmony, as it were. We get the root chord. It's only because we're able to make sense of things in light of what we have done that we are able to realize that we could do things differently. When we adapt, we change, we move, we manipulate. We do this precisely because we're paying so careful attention of the way things are. I'm able to pick the right helmet for the right circumstance in the right season because I bike a lot. But because I bike a lot, I'm hopefully getting my body to the point where I'm able to adapt and move and ride the mountain rather than just trying to resist it and fight it. What it gives me, I'm able hopefully to incorporate and then change in response rather than sticking to my guns and trying to run through a rock rather than flow over it. This is what Atticus also recognizes when he says, I packed my bags and stepped out onward, right? The dusty roads of tomorrow and the never been. That's where we come to realize this complicated intersection of stasis and possibility. It's still water, that cesspool of a pond, and that clear crystal mountain river. It's still water. There's still something shared. But what changes is the way we relate to it and how we then put it into motion. So as we think about the new season, moving into the spring, I want to invite you and encourage you to think about this complicated dynamic between Parmenidean being, stasis, the same, and this Heraclitean understanding of the constancy of change, that everything is in motion, everything is given to us in different ways. It's only when we get both parts, when we put on different helmets at different times, that we become better able to make sense of our role in shaping what it is that becomes possible. How we navigate the trail we are on really does impact the trails we become capable of riding. So as we find ourselves today, here, now, maybe frustrated by the fact that things seem so heavy, so stressful, so unending, let's also think about the fact that we get some choice in how we relate to where we are. That who we are is not something necessarily fully decided, but it's actually an opportunity. We are who we are becoming. So if we don't like who we're becoming, change who you are. That idea of tweaking our habits, this is the way that we make different habits emerge. So I at least find this really helpful because sometimes when we think about complicated metaphysics, it can get so abstract that we don't really see why this matters except as a debate among philosophers sitting in ivory towers. But if we think about simply the question, why do we need different helmets? Why do we need helmets at all? Why do we pick different things in response to different circumstances? We can remember this tension between how we find things to be and how we hope they might become. And both are part of our experience, part of our existence, and part of how it is that we become who we hope to be. Anyway, again, these are videos that are meant to be a little bit more informal, kind of thinking out loud with you, less teaching you something and inviting you to think with me about the questions with which I wrestle, I struggle. It is the case that I sometimes really, I don't know how to make sense of where I'm going because sometimes I'm so frustrated by where I am. And yet, if I don't take stock of where I am, I can't think clearly about where I wish I were. It's that complicated tension that Heraclitus and Parmenides invite us into. May we all learn how to become adaptively attuned, like Aaron James suggests, without thinking that we are somehow going to conquer reality. Maybe we can learn to move with it. What I sometimes tell my students is, the rocks and trees, the mountains, they're gonna win. You aren't gonna win in your, battle with the rock, regardless of which helmet you're wearing. But if we learn to be adaptively attuned, if we recognize some things are static and stable, that rock's not moving, my skull will, right? Like, how do I recognize that stasis, but also realize the change, that I can move and adjust my positioning, wear a different helmet, adapt my foot position on the way down. These things become possible. So though the mountain will always win, we become people who can ride mountains. Change in the context of stability. We become because we are changing things. That tension is what animates existence, and I hope propels us in ways that allows us not to become restless, having stayed too long, but also not people who never find home. So maybe we need to move down the dusty roads of tomorrow and the never been, but also sometimes rest our head in ways that allow us to realize this is a space where I'm okay, even though it isn't. This is a time where I'm good, even though things aren't. That tension is powerful. So strap on your helmets, ride the mountains, ride the waves, and do so by always remembering that things are changing, even when it looks like they're not. And it's only because maybe what really matters is unchanging that we are constantly able to adapt to what comes. All right, well, I thank you again. Really, really enjoy doing these videos and thinking with you in this longer form. Talk with me, think with me. Let's talk along the way. Drop in comments. Let's think together before we open it up and invite the rest of the world to think with us next month about these topics. All right, as always, reach out if you've got any questions. I'm thrilled to respond any way I can. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.